Picture this. A young warrior named Nomalanjana, eldest son and heir to the Ndwandwe throne, stands on the banks of the White Mfolozi River in southeastern Africa. He commands 12,000 men, the largest army in the region. He looks across the water at a small hill where perhaps 4,000 fighters are huddled at the summit, and he laughs. He turns to his commanders and says something that would become his epitaph. It will be like butchering cattle in a kraal. By sundown, over half his army is dead. The cattle in the kraal had teeth. The man on top of that hill was Shaka Zulu, a bastard prince whose own father had named him after an intestinal beetle as an insult to his mother. He had been cast out as a child, humiliated as a teenager, and now, at roughly 30 years old, barefoot and holding a weapon he had personally redesigned, he was about to prove that the most dangerous creature in southern Africa wasn't the lion, the leopard, or the crocodile. It was a man with nothing to lose and everything to invent. This is the Battle of Gqokli Hill, the story of how one outcast reinvented warfare itself and built the most feared army the African continent had ever seen. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand why Gqokli Hill matters, you need to understand how absurd African warfare was before Shaka redesigned it. In the early 1800s, the Nguni peoples of southeastern Africa fought battles that were closer to angry football matches than actual wars. Two armies would line up about 40 meters apart, roughly half a soccer pitch. Each warrior carried an assegai, a throwing spear nearly 6 feet long, and a small rawhide shield barely larger than a dinner plate. They would hurl their spears at each other in high arcs, easy to dodge, easy to block. When both sides ran out of spears, they would shout insults, declare a winner based on who looked more impressive, and go home. Casualties were minimal. Honor was preserved. Nobody really got hurt. This wasn't warfare, it was theater. Shaka watched this pantomime and felt physically sick. He had grown up as an outcast. His father, Senzangakona, the chief of the tiny Zulu clan, a group of barely 1/500 people occupying a territory smaller than a modern city, had impregnated his mother Nandi before marriage and then denied paternity, claiming the pregnancy was caused by an intestinal beetle called Ishaka. That insult became the boy's name. His mother was eventually installed as a reluctant third wife, but the relationship was miserable and both were driven from the court. Shaka spent his childhood being beaten by other boys, mocked for his illegitimacy, and hardened by humiliation into something far more dangerous than a prince, a man with a grudge and a brain. In his late teens, Shaka found refuge with the Mthethwa, the most powerful confederation in the region, serving under their chief Dingiswayo, a rare visionary who had already begun experimenting with military organization. Dingiswayo recognized something extraordinary in the angry young exile. He put Shaka in command of a regiment called the iklwa, and that's when everything changed. Shaka looked at the traditional throwing spear and saw a fatal design flaw. You throw it and now you're unarmed. Worse, your enemy picks it up and throws it back. It was a weapon that literally armed your opponent. So Shaka took a hunting spear, shorter with a broader, heavier blade, and turned it into a weapon of war. The iklwa was roughly a meter long, with a blade the length of a man's forearm, wide as a hand, and sharp enough to split cowhide. Its name came from the sound it made when pulled from a wound, a wet, sucking noise that became the soundtrack of Shaka's conquests. But the iklwa wasn't just a weapon, it was a philosophy. It meant you couldn't fight from a safe distance anymore. You had to close with the enemy, lock shields, and drive that broad blade into the gap between his ribs. Shaka paired it with a new shield, the isilangu, a massive oval of cowhide that covered the body from shoulder to shin. A warrior would hook the left edge of his shield behind the enemy's, then wrench it sideways, ripping the opponent's guard open and exposing the entire left side of his torso for the killing thrust. This wasn't a modification, it was a revolution in a meter of iron and wood. Now, here is where we need to correct a massive misconception. In Western accounts, Shaka is often presented as a lone genius who invented everything from scratch, a black Napoleon who appeared from nowhere. That is an oversimplification, pure and simple. Shaka didn't invent the iklwa. Scholars now believe the short stabbing spear had been used for generations as a hunting tool and a weapon for finishing off fleeing enemies. What Shaka did was far more radical than invention. He standardized it. He made it mandatory. He banned his warriors from throwing their spears. Losing your iklwa was punishable by death. He turned a sidearm into a primary weapon and built an entire military system around the simple idea that close combat wins wars. He also forced his warriors to discard their sandals and run barefoot, hardening their feet until they could sprint across thorns and rock. His regiments, Amabutho, could cover 50 miles in a day, arriving at the battlefield at a dead run while their enemies were still eating breakfast. And then came the formation that made all of it lethal, the Impondo Zenkomo, the horns of the buffalo. In 1817, the balance of power in southeastern Africa shattered. Zwaid, the king of the Ndwandwe, the most powerful military force in the region, a man who collected the skulls of defeated chiefs and displayed them in his mother's hut, captured and murdered Dingiswayo, Shaka's mentor and protector. Without Dingiswayo, the Mthethwa Confederation collapsed overnight. Thousands of leaderless warriors needed a new king. Shaka stepped into the vacuum and absorbed them all. The Zulu, previously a clan small enough to fit inside a football stadium, suddenly had an army. Zwaid watched this with growing alarm. He had killed Dingiswayo to eliminate a rival. Instead, he had created a monster. He decided to crush Shaka before the monster could grow teeth. In April 1818, Zwaid dispatched his eldest son and heir, Nomalanjana, with a force of approximately 12,000 Ndwandwe warriors to annihilate the upstart Zulu. Shaka had roughly 4,000 fighters. He was outnumbered 3-1. His nation was less than 2 years old. A conventional battle on open ground would be suicide. So Shaka did something that revealed the difference between a warrior and a general. He didn't fight the battle his enemy expected. He designed a battle his enemy couldn't win. The first thing Shaka did was remove everything his enemy could use. He scorched the earth south of the White Mfolozi River, burning crops and driving all livestock into hiding in the dense Nkandla forest far to the south. The Ndwandwe would find no food, no water, no cattle. They were marching into a desert of Shaka's making. Then he posted skirmishers at the river fords. The Mfolozi was still running high from late rains, and there were only 2 places where an army could safely cross. Shaka's men lined the banks at these fords and turned the crossing into a gauntlet. Ndwandwe warriors wading chest-deep through the current, struggling to keep their footing on slippery rocks, made easy targets for men standing on solid ground with short, brutal stabbing spears. Hundreds died in the water before the main Ndwandwe force even reached dry ground. This wasn't a battle, it was pest control. But Shaka knew the river wouldn't hold them forever. The Ndwandwe had the numbers to absorb losses and keep pushing. He needed a killing ground. He chose Gqokli Hill. Gqokli rises from the surrounding landscape like a clenched fist. Steep sides, a flattened summit, and a depression at the top hidden from view below. Shaka arranged his main force in a defensive ring around the hilltop, 5 or 6 ranks deep, presenting a wall of shields and iklwas in every direction. In the hidden depression at the center, he placed his reserve and all his supplies. From below, the Ndwandwe would see what looked like a small, desperate force crouching on a hilltop. They wouldn't see the reserves, they wouldn't see the trap. Then Shaka played his masterstroke. Before Nomalanjana's full army had crossed the river, Shaka detached about 700 warriors and sent them south with a fraction of the Zulu cattle herd, just enough to be visible, just enough to be tempting. Nomalanjana, standing at the base of Gqokli Hill with 8,000 men around him, spotted the cattle moving on the horizon. He saw what he believed was half the Zulu army escorting the entire Zulu herd, the real prize of any African war. Cattle were wealth, prestige, and survival rolled into one. He did exactly what Shaka wanted. He split his force, sending 4 regiments, nearly 4,000 men, chasing after the decoy herd, reducing his assault force to roughly 8,000. This wasn't a mistake. It was the most rational decision Nomalanjana could have made with the information he had. And that's what made Shaka terrifying. He didn't outfight his enemies, he outthought them. By mid-morning, the Ndwandwe have committed. 8 regiments, perhaps 8,000 warriors, are arrayed at the base of Gqokli Hill. They look up at the summit and see a thin circle of Zulu fighters, shields interlocked, waiting. Nomalanjana gives the signal. The drums begin, the attack surges upward, and immediately the terrain starts killing them. Gqokli's slopes are strewn with boulders, loose rock and scrub. As the Ndwandwe charge uphill, their formations begin to compress. The hill narrows as it rises, like an inverted funnel. Warriors who started with room to swing a spear find themselves shoulder to shoulder, then chest to back, then crushed together so tightly they can barely raise their arms. The Ndwandwe are armed with traditional long-throwing assegais. These weapons are designed to be hurled from distance in high arcing tosses. But as the attackers close the gap, the arc becomes impossible. There isn't enough room to throw. Warriors at the front can't use their weapons because the men behind them are pushing them forward. Warriors at the back can't throw because their own men are in the way. The Zulu, by contrast, are perfectly positioned. They stand in a tight ring at the summit, shields locked, iklwas jutting between them like the spines of a hedgehog. Each Zulu warrior occupies a fixed position and can see exactly what's coming. As the Ndwandwe scramble up the last few yards of the slope, already winded from the climb, already compressed into a crowd, they meet a wall of cowhide and iron. The physics of this encounter are devastating. An Ndwandwe warrior arrives at the summit exhausted, crammed against his comrades, unable to extend his throwing arm. He is holding a 6-foot pole that is useless at arm's length. The Zulu facing him has a 1-meter blade designed for exactly this distance. The Zulu hooks his massive isilangu behind the Ndwandwe's smaller rawhide shield and wrenches it aside, ripping the man's guard open. The Ndwandwe's ribs, his stomach, his entire left flank is now exposed. The iklwa punches through soft tissue with a short, controlled thrust. The man drops. The Zulu steps forward over the body. The next Ndwandwe is already being pushed into the gap by the men behind him. The Ndwandwe throw their assegais in desperation, but they are throwing uphill at men crouching behind massive shields. The spears either clatter off the cowhide or sail over the defenders entirely. The Zulu don't throw back. This is critical. Shaka has forbidden it. Every thrown spear is a weapon lost. Every weapon lost is a warrior disarmed. The Ndwandwe are literally giving the Zulu ammunition while receiving nothing in return. Discipline on the Zulu line is inhuman. They do not break rank, they do not chase. They hold the ring and they stab and they stab and they stab. The Ndwandwe are brave. They are not cowards, and this needs to be said clearly. These are warriors from the most powerful nation in the region, men who have conquered a dozen chiefdoms. They charge the hilltop again and again, climbing over the bodies of their own dead, trying to find gaps in the Zulu ring. Some manage to close with the defenders and fight hand to hand, swinging the heavy knobkerrie clubs that every warrior carries as a sidearm, targeting heads and elbows, and the hands gripping those terrible short spears. But the mathematics are merciless. Every step uphill costs energy. Every step costs formation. And the Zulu are fresh, hydrated. Shaka has supplies hidden in the depression at the summit, while the Ndwandwe are fighting in the heat with no water and no food, because Shaka has burned everything for miles. By midday, the assault has stalled. Bodies are piled on the slopes. Ndwandwe warriors begin slipping away from the fight, not in panic but in desperation. They are dying of thirst. The White Mfolozi River is behind them, and one by one, then in groups, men abandon the assault to crawl back to the water. Nomalanjana sees his army melting. He makes a decision that a conventional commander would consider sound. He concentrates his remaining regiments for one massive push at a single point on the Zulu ring. Mass everything. Break through. Win. And here Shaka springs the real trap. The moment the Ndwandwe concentrate on one face of the hill, the opposite side of the Zulu ring goes quiet. Shaka, watching from the summit, gives the signal. His reserves, fresh, rested, hidden all day in the depression, pour out of the center of the ring, split into 2 columns, and sprint down the undefended side of the hill in the classic horns of the buffalo. They sweep around the base of Gqokli in a double envelopment, slamming into the rear and flanks of the Ndwandwe concentration. The Ndwandwe are now being stabbed from the front, from the left and from the right. They can't retreat because the Zulu horns are closing behind them. They can't advance because the summit is a wall of shields. They are packed so tightly they can barely move. This wasn't a battle anymore. It was a compression kill. The slaughter intensified as the afternoon wore on. Ndwandwe warriors, trapped in the closing ring, fought with anything they had: fists, teeth, broken spear shafts. Some threw themselves at the Zulu shields with their bare hands, trying to wrench them aside. Others tried to break through the encirclement toward the river and were cut down from behind. By late afternoon, the Ndwandwe army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Of the 8,000 who had assaulted the hill, traditional accounts claim over 7,000 were killed, though these numbers come from much later sources and should be treated cautiously. What is clear is that the destruction was total enough to send shockwaves across southeastern Africa. The 4,000 men who had chased the decoy cattle herd returned to find the battlefield carpeted with their dead, and they withdrew in horror. Nomalanjana himself was among the fallen. The man who had compared the attack to butchering cattle in a pen had discovered too late that the pen was built around him. When the last Ndwandwe fighter fell and the dust began to settle on Gqokli Hill, Shaka didn't celebrate. He did something far more unsettling. He walked the battlefield. According to oral tradition, passed down through generations, compiled by early collectors of Zulu history, and eventually written down over a century later, Shaka moved among the dead and the dying, examining wounds. He studied which thrusts had killed instantly, and which had merely wounded. He noted where the iklwa had punched through muscle, and where it had glanced off bone. He was grading his own weapon on the bodies of his enemies like an engineer conducting a product test. Then he called his surviving warriors together. He praised the regiments that had held the ring, but he also singled out men whose iklwas were not bloodied, warriors who had fought at positions where the enemy never reached the summit. He told them, in front of the entire army, that they had not earned the right to eat meat that night. Shaka wasn't just winning a battle, he was building a culture. Every warrior understood the message. It was not enough to survive. You had to kill. And if you didn't kill, you were nothing. Over the next year, Shaka finished what Gqokli had started. When Zwide sent a second, larger invasion force, Shaka didn't stand and fight. He retreated, drawing the Ndwandwe deep into Zulu territory, stretching their supply lines across the scorched earth he had prepared for them. When they were exhausted, starving and strung out across miles of empty grassland, Shaka turned and annihilated them at the Mulatu's river. Zwide's kingdom shattered. The survivors scattered north, triggering a chain reaction of displacement, warfare and migration that swept across half the continent. This was the Mumfikan, the crushing. For the next 25 years, the shockwaves from Shaka's wars depopulated vast stretches of southern and central Africa. Entire peoples were uprooted, driven north into modern Tanzania and Zimbabwe by the expanding Zulu military machine and by the war bands of Shaka's imitators, men who had learned his methods and used them to carve out their own kingdoms. The death toll is debated. Estimates range from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million, but the scale is not. By 1824, when the first European traders arrived at the Zulu court, they found Shaka ruling 250,000 people and commanding an army of 40,000 warriors. The tiny clan of 1/500 had become the dominant power in southeastern Africa. Shaka stared at the Europeans and their muskets. He was unimpressed. He told them the Zulu way was superior. But here is the foreshadowing that makes this story a tragedy. The weapon that built Shaka's empire was not the iklwa, it was fear. And fear, once it becomes your only tool, eventually turns inward. In October 1827, Shaka's mother Nandi died of dysentery. And the man who had revolutionized warfare, who had outthought every enemy placed before him, lost his mind. He imposed a year of national mourning so extreme it defied belief. No crops were to be planted. No milk was to be consumed. In a society where milk was a dietary staple, this was a sentence of starvation. No sexual relations were permitted. Women found pregnant were killed alongside their husbands. cows nursing calves were slaughtered, so that in Shaka's words, even the animals would know the pain of losing a mother. He sent his exhausted army on campaign after campaign with no rest, no purpose, and no end. Warriors who showed insufficient grief were executed. The kingdom that had been built on discipline was now being governed by madness. And this is the scene that defines everything Shaka was, everything he built, and everything it cost. On September 22, 1828, while the bulk of his army was deployed on a distant campaign, Shaka sat at his Kwadukuza homestead with almost no bodyguard. His personal attendant, Mbofa Kasithayi, approached him from behind. Two half-brothers, Dingane and Malangana, were with him. Mbofa struck first. He drove an assegai into Shaka's back. Dingane and Malangana followed, stabbing the king as he staggered forward. The man who had taught an entire continent the killing power of the short spear was being murdered with the weapon he had perfected. As he bled out on the ground, Shaka looked at his half-brother Dingane, the man he had allowed to live, the man he could have executed a dozen times but never did, and spoke his last words. The exact phrasing varies between oral traditions, but the most widely attested version, recorded by King Cetshwayo's nephew Mukabeni, is devastating in its cold prophecy. Are you stabbing me, kings of the earth? You will come to an end through killing one another. They dumped his body in an unmarked grain pit and filled it in. No funeral, no songs, no ceremony for the man who had built the mightiest kingdom Southern Africa had ever known. Dingane took the throne. Within 12 years, he was overthrown and murdered by another half-brother, Mpande. Shaka's prophecy had come true before the grain pit had settled. Here's why this story cuts deeper than a spear. We tell the story of military genius as if it's always a European story. Alexander, Caesar, Napoleon. When Africa appears, it appears as a backdrop, a place things happened to rather than a place where things were invented. But on a hilltop in Zululand in 1818, a man who had never seen a book, never studied a Roman formation, never heard of Hannibal or Alexander, independently arrived at the same conclusions that the greatest military minds in history had reached. Close combat beats ranged combat, discipline beats numbers, logistics beats bravery, and the general who chooses the battlefield chooses the winner. The tragedy isn't that Shaka was destroyed, it's that he destroyed himself, and the weapon was the same one he'd always used. The system that made the Zulu unbeatable on the battlefield made them ungovernable in peacetime. An army built on fear can only expand. The moment it stops, it eats itself. So the next time someone tells you that military innovation requires gunpowder or textbooks or the traditions of the West, point them to a barefoot man on a hill in Zululand, holding a spear named for the sound of death, who looked at a world that fought with theater and said, "Not anymore." He proved that the most dangerous weapon isn't technology. It's an idea. And the most dangerous idea is the one that works. If you made it this far, you're a true history enthusiast. Please verify your subscription now. It really helps the channel keep these forgotten stories alive. Check out this next video on the screen about the rise and fall of the Zulu Empire, where we explore what happened when Shaka's warriors met British rifles. I'll see you there.